Perfect Strangers once had America laughing out loud with the goofy misadventures of its unlikely cousins. But nearly 40 years later, the cast's real-life journeys have taken shocking turns. One died suddenly, another vanished from Hollywood under the crushing weight of fame, while someone once dismissed as forgettable has quietly become a millionaire with a fortune that shocks everyone. Seeing them today, you'd hardly believe these are the same people you watched decades ago. James Noble as Walter Appleton. James Noble was born on March 5, 1922, in Dallas, Texas. At 64 years old, he played Walter Appleton, the stern but deeply affectionate father of Larry Appleton in Perfect Strangers, 1989. His role served as the emotional backbone of Larry's complicated family dynamic, bringing both pressure and tenderness every time he appeared. Yet behind the steady paternal image was a man quietly drowning in a marriage full of invisible storms. His wife, actress Carolyn Coates, endured years of chronic illness that turned their home into a place of late-night emergencies. James carried that emotional weight into his work, even while delivering beloved performances in Benson and 1776. He felt himself slowly unraveling under the strain of watching the person he loved slip further away. Therapy became a lifeline. When Carolyn passed away, the grief was sharp enough to feel physical. Suddenly raising his daughter alone, he struggled to steady himself while his career felt increasingly uncertain. The emotional exhaustion hardened into fatigue that never fully left him, and years of internal strain began carving themselves into his body. Finally, James Noble died on March 28, 2016, at the age of 94 after suffering a severe stroke. His remaining estate, valued at approximately $1.5 million in 2025, came from television royalties and a modest New Jersey property he had held on to for decades. Eugene Roche as Harry Burns. Eugene Roche was born on September 22, 1928, in Boston, Massachusetts. At 58 years old, he joined Perfect Strangers, 1987, as Harry Burns, the clumsy but kind-hearted neighbor whose misguided advice constantly complicated Larry and Balky's lives. His recurring role brought warmth and a familiar comedic rhythm to the show. But behind the humor was a marriage collapsing under real, painful circumstances. In 1953, Eugene married Marjorie Susan Perkins, and they went on to have 9 children, including actors Eamon Roche, Brogan Roche, and writer-producer Sean Roche. By the mid-1970s, Marjorie was overwhelmed by raising 9 children while Eugene spent months away on regional theater contracts. Their arguments became explosive. Marjorie accused him of prioritizing the stage over his family. Eugene accused her of resenting his career when his fame exploded with the Ajax Man commercials, earning him millions between 1971 and 1976. Jealousy and distrust intensified. Their divorce finalized in 1981 after a bitter custody dispute involving their younger children, forcing Eugene to divide his income and sell personal property to support them. The emotional damage followed him into work. During filming of Slaughterhouse-Five, 1972, and Magnum P.I., he frequently arrived exhausted from late-night legal meetings and child support negotiations. His second marriage to Antoni Claire Bratman in 1982 was calmer, but his career entered a painful decline. After years of steady television work, he faced long unemployment stretches between 1983 to 1986. Casting directors repeatedly associated him with the Ajax commercials and refused to see him for dramatic roles. The humiliation cut deep. To stay afloat, he accepted minor villain roles on Kojak, The Streets of San Francisco, and Murder, She Wrote, even when his chronic heart disease made shooting difficult. He experienced chest tightness so severe during a night court filming day that production halted for several hours. By the early 1990s, he was taking heart medication daily while still working to support older children who struggled financially. Eugene Roche died on July 28, 2004, at the age of 75 after a sudden heart attack in Encino, California. His remaining estate, valued at about $2 million in 2025, came from decades of commercial royalties and television residuals. Belita Moreno as Lydia. Belita Moreno was born on November 1st, 1949 in Dallas, Texas. At 37 years old, she joined Perfect Strangers, 1986, as Lydia Markham, the sharp, outspoken lawyer who later became Larry's girlfriend across more than 70 episodes. Her presence brought intelligence, speed, and an emotional contrast to the chaotic humor of the show. It remains one of her most recognizable television roles. But Belita's life behind the camera was defined by a marriage constantly strained by the weight of her career. She married Joel Rudnick in 1981 after a short, difficult earlier marriage that had already left her emotionally guarded. As a Latina actress in the 1980s, she was repeatedly typecast, rejected for roles, and told she was too ethnic unless playing maids or comedic stereotypes. The discrimination did not just wound her pride, it followed her home. Joel, a screenwriter struggling for his own breakthrough, felt overshadowed whenever Belita worked with A-list directors like Robert Altman. Their arguments centered on jealousy, household finances, and Belita's long filming hours. The tension deepened during her guest roles on ER and Melrose Place, when she often returned home exhausted. The pressure worsened when Belita took a step back from acting in the late 1990s to raise her two children. The sudden emptiness of not working triggered a deep depressive episode she later admitted came like a fog that never lifted. Joel tried to help, but his own career frustrations only deepened the emotional gap between them. Belita's return to television in George Lopez, 2002 to 2007, became both salvation and strain. The role of Benny Lopez revived her career, earned her an NAACP Image Award nomination, and helped stabilize her mental health. But the long shooting schedule revived old conflicts at home. She navigated therapy, marriage counseling, and recurring anxiety attacks, all while balancing rising fame with a household still healing from years of resentment and instability. Today, Belita Moreno is 76 years old and has retired from acting, living quietly in Texas with her family. She occasionally coaches young performers and supports Latino representation in Hollywood, drawing from the battles she once fought alone. Her estimated net worth of $3 million in 2025 comes from television royalties and her long career as an acting coach. Ernie Sabella as Donald Twinkasetti. Ernie Sabella was born on September 19, 1949, in Westchester County, New York. At 37 years old, he joined Perfect Strangers, 1986, as Donald Twinkasetti, the sleazy, corner-cutting store owner and first boss of Larry and Balky during the show's opening seasons. His comedic greed and frantic energy shaped the tone of the earliest episodes and made him one of the sitcom's most memorable antagonists. But Sabella's personal life was shaken by a marriage that unraveled under career disappointment. In the early 1990s, long periods of unemployment on Broadway and the humiliation of repeated rejections pushed him into alcohol dependency. His self-worth plummeted so severely that during his early voice tests for Disney, he admitted he feared he was not good enough to keep the lights on. Recovery, slow, painful, and full of setbacks, began only after he met Cheryl, a computer programmer, in 1994 backstage at Guys and Dolls. Their relationship pulled him out of the destructive spiral, but the financial instability lingered. Even after winning the role of Pumbaa in The Lion King, 1994, a role that would define his entire career, Sabella lived with the constant fear of being replaced. During his 50s and 60s, declining energy, rising industry ageism, and a thinning Broadway market intensified his anxiety. He took whatever roles he could, guest spots on The Practice, That's So Raven, Saved by the Bell, and various Broadway productions, while managing blood pressure issues, stress-related tremors, and episodes of panic. Now, Ernie Sabella is 76 years old and still active as a voice actor, continuing to reprise Pumbaa in various Disney media. He lives a stable life with Cheryl and works regularly, though at a slower pace than before. His estimated net worth of $5 million in 2025 comes primarily from decades of Disney royalties and recurring voiceover work. Jo Marie Payton as Harriet Winslow. Jo Marie Payton was born on August 3, 1950, in Albany, Georgia. At 36 years old, she joined Perfect Strangers, 1986, as Harriet Winslow, the warm, outspoken elevator operator whose charisma was strong enough to inspire the spin-off Family Matters. Her character became one of television's most iconic TV moms, and her first appearance on Perfect Strangers set the foundation for a cultural phenomenon. But her real life was far more turbulent than the steady, loving Harriet she portrayed. Jo Marie's first marriage to Mark France, 1980 to 1987, collapsed under the pressure of constant financial instability and her growing career demands. As she began gaining attention on Perfect Strangers, Mark struggled with jealousy and the feeling that her success overshadowed his own ambitions. Their arguments turned into long silences, and resentment eventually broke the marriage apart. When Jo Marie remarried Rodney Noble in 1993, she hoped for emotional stability, but Family Matters had just entered its most chaotic years. Her brutal on-set clashes with Jaleel White, including a near-physical altercation that required producers to separate them, drained her emotionally. The stress from set followed her home, and by 1998, that marriage also ended in divorce. Her third marriage to Landris Clark, 1998 to 2004, brought new hope, but the emotional scars from years of stress, anger, and overwork resurfaced quickly. During this period, Jo Marie felt increasingly erased from her own show as Steve Urkel became the focus, leaving her feeling humiliated and powerless. That frustration bled into her home life, fueling arguments that eventually tore the marriage apart. When she left Family Matters in 1997, she was mentally exhausted, physically depleted, and carrying years of suppressed resentment. The long-term stress caught up with her in the most devastating way. In 2019, she suffered a massive stroke, losing parts of her speech and mobility. Now, Jo Marie Payton is 75 years old and still acting, often lending her voice to the Proud Family revival while making selective TV appearances. She rebuilt her life with determination, and her estimated net worth of $4 million comes from decades of royalties from Family Matters, Perfect Strangers, and her voice work Sam Anderson as Sam Gorpley. Sam Anderson was born on April 2, 1947, in Clark, South Dakota. At 39 years old, he joined Perfect Strangers, 1986, as Sam Gorpley, the grumpy, dismissive supervisor at the Chicago Chronicle whose constant irritation created comedic chaos for Larry and Balky. His performance became one of the show's most memorable workplace dynamics. But Sam's personal life was shaped by a first marriage that collapsed under financial pressure. Before fame, he was married to a partner whose name he never publicly disclosed, during his years struggling as a young teacher and aspiring actor. They lived in Wahpeton, North Dakota, sometimes surviving on his small community theater paychecks and her part-time wages. By 1974, after repeated eviction warnings, unpaid utility bills, and Sam frequently traveling to Los Angeles for auditions, the marriage fractured. Fights centered on money, instability, and Sam's long-term gamble on acting. The divorce left him with debt and emotional guilt that followed him to California, affecting early roles in Growing Pains and Hill Street Blues. In 1985, Sam married Barbara Ann Hancock, a former dancer and actress, marking a turning point. After Lost ended in 2010, Sam entered one of the hardest periods of his career. He was repeatedly told he looked too old for network television and not marketable for major films. The rejections piled up. To survive, he pivoted into voiceover contracts, emergency room training videos, children's audiobooks, pharmaceutical commercials, and even automated phone messages. Some months, voiceover work was his only income. Today, Sam Anderson is 78 years old and continues to work selectively, most recently appearing in the 2024 Matlock reboot. He attends fan conventions, teaches occasional acting workshops, and remains active despite lingering anxiety from past career droughts. His estimated net worth of $2 million in 2025 comes from decades of television royalties, film residuals, and a long, steady run as one of television's most dependable character actors, Mark Linn-Baker as Larry Appleton. Mark Linn-Baker was born on June 17, 1954, in St. Louis, Missouri. At 32 years old, he joined Perfect Strangers, 1986, as Larry Appleton, the anxious, ambitious American cousin whose uptight personality played perfectly against Balky's innocence. Across 150 episodes, his role became the emotional backbone of the series and defined one of TV's most beloved comedic duos. But the man behind Larry Appleton faced a marriage that slowly crumbled under the momentum of his rising fame. Mark married Adrienne LaBelle in the mid-1990s, a respected stage designer, and the daughter of legendary children's author Arnold LaBelle. Their marriage began with artistic harmony, but the emotional toll of Mark's transition from national television to unpredictable theater work proved suffocating. During long rehearsal periods for Broadway productions, Mark often returned home mentally exhausted, leaving Adrienne to manage their daughter alone. As his career became more erratic after Perfect Strangers, financial strain and the fear of professional decline intensified their conflicts. By the late 2000s, their arguments were constant, and the marriage collapsed in 2009. His second marriage to Krista Justice in 2012 began with promise, but the emotional fatigue from his previous divorce lingered. As he tried to refocus his career on theater, he faced a new wave of setbacks, being passed over for major roles, dealing with producers who still saw him as Larry, and struggling with the fading financial security of TV syndication. Every rejection weighed heavier than the last. Even during highlights like his critically praised work in My Favorite Year, 1982, and A Year with Frog and Toad on Broadway, Mark carried the silent fear that his best years were behind him. The emotional strain led to insomnia, panic episodes before auditions, and long creative droughts that left him questioning his talent. Yet he kept pushing, trying to rebuild a life shaped by both artistic success and private heartbreak. Now, Mark Linn-Baker is 71 years old and primarily focused on theater, continuing to perform and direct with the dedication that has defined his career. He maintains a modest life centered on stage work, with an estimated net worth of $3 million earned through decades of acting, directing, and Broadway revivals. Scott Marlowe as Marco Madison. Scott Marlowe was born on June 24, 1932, in Newark, New Jersey. At 54 years old, he joined Perfect Strangers in 1990, appearing as Marco Madison, a sharp-edged, unpredictable antagonist whose presence added rare darkness to the show's fourth season. Across roughly 5 episodes, he played the kind of troubled villain that had defined much of his early Hollywood identity. But behind the camera, Scott carried a pain that ran far deeper than the troubled young delinquents he'd once portrayed. As a bisexual man who came of age in the conservative 1950s, he faced constant rejection, coded discrimination, and casting directors who openly told him he was too risky for leading roles. His refusal to hide who he was cost him opportunities, and the strain of navigating Hollywood's hypocrisy fed years of self-doubt. Scott never married, not because he didn't desire companionship, but because every long-term relationship he attempted buckled under pressure. For an actor who once headlined The Cool and the Crazy, his personal life felt increasingly isolated. That loneliness only intensified as his career shifted. After decades of being typecast as the delinquent or the reckless youth, Scott fought desperately to reinvent himself, taking roles in Star Trek, The Next Generation, and other dramas. But the industry's unwillingness to see him as anything but a troubled boy trapped him professionally, leaving him frustrated and emotionally drained. The constant grind led to severe depression in the 1980s and 1990s, intensified by fading fame and the absence of a stable partner. His health began to crumble as stress-related heart problems emerged, and by the late 1990s, he was living a quiet, increasingly withdrawn life, with only sporadic roles. Sadly, Scott Marlowe died of a sudden heart attack on January 6, 2001 in Los Angeles at the age of 68. His estate, valued at roughly $1 million by 2025, came mostly from decades of television royalties and residuals from his cult favorite films Bronson Pinchot as Balki Bartokomous. Bronson Pinchot was born on May 20, 1959 in New York City. At 27 years old, he joined Perfect Strangers, 1986, as Balki Bartokomous, the innocent, big-hearted shepherd from fictional mypos, whose childlike wonder carried the entire series over 150 episodes. Balki became one of television's most beloved comedic creations, and Bronson became the unexpected star who defined the show's identity. Yet behind Balki's joy lived a man fighting battles far heavier than most fans ever realized. In the 1990s, at the height of his fame, Bronson spiraled into a destructive cocaine addiction that nearly obliterated both his personal life and career. The drug became his escape from a childhood scarred by poverty, bullying, and a father who abandoned the family. When he finally came out as gay in the 2010s, he admitted that decades of hiding had left him exhausted and spiritually hollow. The consequences of his private turmoil deeply affected his professional path. After Perfect Strangers, Bronson struggled to find roles that matched Balki's success, and box office failures like Second Sight pushed him into financial instability. His attempt to reinvent himself through real estate restoration sounded promising, until mismanagement and overwhelming renovation costs drove him into massive debt, losing millions and forcing him into bankruptcy. During these years, stress triggered health problems, anxiety attacks, and long periods of isolation that halted his momentum as an actor. Only his work as a voice performer, including his return as Serge in Beverly Hills Cop and his comedic roles in Kung Fu Panda spin-offs, kept him connected to the industry. Today, Bronson Pinchot is 66 years old and living a quieter life dedicated to restoring historic homes, his lifelong passion. Though he no longer pursues fame in the same way, he continues to work selectively in voice acting and television. His estimated net worth of $2 million reflects both his resilience and the tumultuous financial journey he has survived. Rebecca Arthur as Mary Ann Spencer. Rebecca Arthur was born on March 17, 1960, in Cumberland, Maryland. At 26 years old, she joined Perfect Strangers, 1986, as Mary Ann Spencer, the clumsy, soft-hearted flight attendant whose innocent charm became the perfect romantic balance to Balki. Over 106 episodes, she built one of the show's sweetest love stories. Yet Rebecca's real life held shadows the sitcom never showed. Her father died when she was still a baby, leaving a wound she carried into adulthood. Growing up with that loss shaped her fear of instability, and when she later married Roger Golden in 1996, the desire to build a safe, nurturing home for her children consumed her. But motherhood arrived with overwhelming pressure. She quit acting in the mid-1990s to raise her daughters Lena and Stella, and the sudden end of her career left her wrestling with identity loss. Her husband's demanding work schedule often left her alone, juggling childcare and the quiet grief of watching Hollywood move on without her. By the early 2000s, Rebecca attempted to return to the industry, but the doors that once opened easily were now firmly shut. Casting directors no longer recognized her, and producers viewed her as the girl from an old sitcom, not a viable actress. Each failed audition deepened the self-doubt that had already been seeded by her father's absence. She spoke privately about sinking into bouts of depression during this period. Her work in Get Shorty, 1995, became one of her last major appearances before she chose to withdraw completely, focusing instead on healing and protecting her family life from the pressures she had once chased. Today, Rebecca. Arthur is 65 years old and living a peaceful, private life with her family. She has stepped away from Hollywood entirely, dedicating herself to home and personal stability. Her estimated net worth of $1 million comes from early film work, Perfect Strangers royalties, and careful financial management. Melanie Wilson as Jennifer Lyons. Melanie Wilson was born on October 14, 1960, in Los Angeles County, California. At 26 years old, she joined Perfect Strangers, 1986, as Jennifer Lyons, the gentle, steady girlfriend of Larry Appleton, whose warmth helped balance the show's chaos. Across more than 72 episodes, she became an indispensable part of the series' emotional core. But what the audience never knew was how much pressure Melanie carried long before she stepped onto the sitcom set. As the daughter of Dick Wilson, the iconic Mr. Whipple from the Charmin commercials, she grew up under the heavy expectations of Hollywood legacy. Her first marriage to Joe in 1988 cracked under that pressure. Melanie's rising visibility on Perfect Strangers collided with Joe's discomfort with the industry, turning small disagreements into widening emotional distance. By the time the marriage ended, Melanie had learned a harsh lesson. Her second marriage to William Bickley, a prominent producer, introduced a new kind of strain. Though grounded in mutual respect, Melanie often felt overshadowed by his long list of credits and the unspoken assumption that she would eventually abandon her career. When Perfect Strangers ended, that expectation only grew stronger. Hollywood offered her few meaningful roles, and instead of fighting to stay afloat in an industry obsessed with youth and reinvention, she chose a quieter exit. Now, Melanie Wilson is 65 years old and lives a private, largely offline life. She occasionally writes and mentors young performers, but rarely appears on camera. Her estimated net worth of $2 million comes from Perfect Strangers' residuals, writing work, and her personal investments. So now it's your turn. Which cast member shocked you the most, and who do you think changed beyond recognition? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our deep dive Hollywood stories.